Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. In today's author interview episode, we're talking to Craig Gallant of the D6 Generation podcast.
Welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. From fantasy to sci-fi to history and horror, your hosts are about to take you on a journey through all things Winged Hussar publishing. Sit back and relax as we talk about writing, gaming, as well as interview some of your favorite authors. Let's wing it.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Brandon.
I'm Mark, the lovable limey sidekick.
This episode, we have a very special guest, a man who has been writing with us since we very first started Winged Hussar Publishing, someone known in the gaming community, the writing community, and the podcasting community. Today, joining us is our friend Craig Gallant.
Hi, nice to meet you, everybody.
As is usual with our author interviews, this is going to be a two-parter. In the first episode, we'll talk with Craig and ask some general questions about his writing technique, so the audience gets to know him a little bit better if you don't already. And in the second episode, we'll dive deeper into his novels and talk about some behind-the-scenes thoughts and motivations, breaking down some of the characters and themes from each novel. Craig, as I mentioned, you've been with us since the very beginning. Not counting my novel's first experimental run, you are our first published fantasy author. But for those who are hearing your name for the first time, can you give our listeners a little bit about who you are, your background, and your involvement with us?
Sure. My name is Craig Gallant, and I live in New Hampshire in the United States. And I have had a podcast, a gaming and geek-related podcast, since 2008. So back at the very beginning of the podcast game, the D6 generation started and got in there, and we kind of caught lightning in a bottle. We ended up just these three jamokes in New Hampshire. We ended up at the number one at various times on iTunes and the other rating systems around the world. It was just really crazy, and it opened a lot of doors for us. We did a lot of amazing interviews with people from all over this industry and the publishing industry, and we had movie people. So it was great. And one of the many cool things that happened was that I sort of got hooked into the writing industry, because on the podcast, I would mention that I loved writing and battle reports and things like that. And people who listened happened to be also big people in the industry, and they started reaching out. So I started writing first for Spartan Games in the UK. And I did, all of their writing was being done by the designers in-house. So they didn't have a lot of fluff or stories. So I started doing that sort of thing for them. Almost at the same time, I got picked up by Fantasy Flight doing role-playing stuff for 40K. So I did a lot of stuff for them for Warhammer 40,000 roleplay. When they when they gave up the 40K roleplay license, I switched over to Star Wars for a bit. So that was really crazy, being able to work with some Star Wars IP. And then they wanted to launch their own world, their own fantasy world for their games. The game Descent takes place in a fantasy world that never got really fleshed out. So I was hired by them by Fantasy Flight to flesh out their fantasy world for their RPG. And ultimately that RPG didn't end up flying. So I wrote a book's worth of fluff that was in limbo for a little while, but then ended up in they have sort of an agnostic role play system now. And they broke up my travelogue that introduced all the different parts of their fantasy world into that agnostic, it's called Terranoth. And so all that stuff saw the light of day, which was neat. In the middle of working for Fantasy Flight, we had one of our biggest advertisers was Battle Foam and Romeo Philippe at Battle Foam. And at Gen Con one year, he confided in me that he was going to start a miniatures game, and I asked if I could do the fluff and all the background for that, and he jumped at that because he knew me, and I did I don't know, over 200,000 words worth of writing for the giant hardback rule book that first came out. And while I was doing that, Vince Rospond, who started Winged Hussar, you might know him, Brandon.
Yeah, just a little bit.
He was the publisher for all of the Wild West Exodus rule books and everything. And Romeo wanted to do comic books. And so we worked with him on that for a little bit. But then he decided, I think Vince convinced him that novels were actually a cheaper investment up front.
Yep.
And so we switched from, we did a graphic novel, which was exciting because I didn't know how to write a graphic novel. So when he asked me if I knew anyone who could write a graphic novel, I asked him to wait half an hour. And then I came back knowing the basics on how to write a graphic novel. So I wrote the graphic novel, worked with Michael Nigro, the artist. He's a phenomenal artist. It was a great, great experience doing that. And then we started with the Wild West Exodus books, and I haven't stopped working with you guys at Winged Hussar ever since. And it's been an awesome, awesome ride.
Absolutely. It's been great having you along for the ride. It's interesting you mentioned the Fantasy Flight, though, because I think before we started Winged Hussar, I was doing a little bit of freelance for them. So I have to check my hard book. I'll have to check my hard book for Only War to see if you and I were in the same book, because that would be an interesting circumstance.
Oh, were you in Only War?
Yes, I did. I worked on the, I think, part of the Armory I was credited for.
No, they started me on, I was doing all the heretic stuff, and so I did a lot of the Chaos books, a lot of the Xenos stuff. I think I was in I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 of the books that they did.
Okay.
But Only War that's where they brought in the Imperial Guard, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that would have been a cooler fit for me but at that time I hadn't done any Chaos armies, and my Xenos armies were a bit behind me. Mm-hmm. So my main armies were Space Wolves and Imperial Guard when I was writing. So I would have loved to. I remember when that came up, I was like, oh, I could do that. But I was in the middle of, I think, doing the Chaos Worlds for one of the, I think, Tzeentch, the Tzeentch book.
Nice. I was gonna say that would have been a cool crossover, preemptively working together. But yeah,
that would have been awesome.
I was a huge Gaunt's Ghost fan. I think I've mentioned this before, but I was a huge Gaunt's Ghost fan, and so I tried to seed in as many little Gaunt's Ghost references as I could.
Yeah, I too am a giant Gaunt's Ghost fan.
I think in terms of having authors on, Craig, you may just have won the game of What's My CV, because that's pretty incredible. We've got an editor who gets rid of the dead air time, but I think it's worth a few seconds just of dead air to just let that sink in of how much you've done.
I'm true. It's crazy when I think about how long I've been doing this. I've been doing this for about 12 years now.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff to pack into 12 years still. So
thank
cracking.
You.
Well, in terms of so we're here mainly to talk about the fiction side of stuff. Yeah. So starting kind of broad brush. So 12 years experience, but before you go into this, and particularly with the novels, the characters, all the stuff you've done for all these different IPs, your previous life before the world of nerd that we all share, have you had any kind of real life experiences or anything which has helped you shape how you put together a novel or how you come up with a concept of characters?
Absolutely. Actually, I am a classically trained actor and director. So I think
the CV just keeps getting better.
Most would say that was a misspent youth, and my real life paychecks would agree. But what it actually does is, I think it gives me, when I'm writing any kind of action or dialogue, I'm looking at it from the point of view of an audience member looking at a play almost, and so. When you're directing a play, you've got the words, but you have to come up with all of the movement and the intonations and the emotions to make it clear to the audience what's happening and to help them. It's all about communication. I'm a theater teacher nowadays. And so that's what I tell my students is theater is all about communication. And so I've been doing that for a really, really, really long time. And so I love action. One of my specialties before I started teaching was stage combat and stage violence. So
Neat.
I have a lot of experience with a lot of different weapons, and as far as hand-to-hand goes, and all the different terminology and the movement. I was on the fencing team at my military college, ended up as the captain. So I know all the terminology, but I also know that people's eyes glaze over when you use most of it. So I like to think I can pull that back and give more of a layman's idea. But as far as how it shapes my writing, I'm trying to communicate. I'm trying to provide interesting visuals and things that will like kind of click with the audience. So I'm sort of looking at it from the point of view of telling this story through scenes, I guess.
Makes sense.
I think so.
So speaking of creating and making the bare bones of how when you go into the writing process, I have one of my new favorite questions. I have two favorite questions I like to ask authors, but one of my new ones is kind of a chicken and the egg question. When you're creating an outline, when you're conceiving what you want to do with the novel, what usually comes first? Do you picture the cast of characters you want to write about, or do you try to figure out the plot first and then fit the characters in afterwards?
It's a great question in that it's a really tough question. I don't know that I can give you an answer that would be really satisfying. My first 5 books, everything was sort of like given to me from Wild West Exodus. So right. It was, we want to write a book about these 4 people and they have to do something like this, that kind of thing.
Right.
And so writing those books, I like to think that I kind of honed my technical abilities, but my structural work and my work as far as how I would build a story really kind of atrophied during that time, or didn't atrophy because I didn't have anything to atrophy. It didn't develop during that time. But then when I started my own stories, I got to tell you, it's like different every time. My science fiction book, Legacy of Shadow, started because I really wanted to write a comedy. And so I wanted to have a comedy that took place on a space station with all kinds of different alien races, and they could all come together and then go off and have adventures. But I wanted it to be funny. And so I did a bunch of background work and word upon word upon word of what the space station would look like and how it would work and all these different alien races. But no story coalesced around that for me. And as I was trying to figure that out, a story that wasn't really funny started to develop. And so I really, really, really wanted to write a short, like 80,000 words, funny comedy introducing this space station. When I sat down to write it, it ended up being like, I don't know, 140,000 words, space opera, much more serious, life and death. And I really enjoyed what it was developing into, but it had nothing to do with what I started out as. And then Crimson Sand, Crimson Snow is my fantasy book that was a concept where I wanted to take a map and I wanted to flip it so the north was hot and the south was cold. That's all I knew. And then one of the many things that I've been blessed with in my life is an opportunity to travel all over the world with educational tours. And I was in the midst of trying to figure out the fantasy book when I went to Peru. And I loved Peru. Machu Picchu in particular was almost like a spiritual experience for me. Walking little bits of the Inca Trail and just that entire mountainous area was just amazing. And so what I ended up doing was I love Vikings, and I thought, what would have happened if the Vikings had met the Incas? And from that concept built this whole elaborate world, which was basically the New England area flipped upside down and then dropped down into the southern hemisphere. And these Viking-like people meeting these Inca-like people, and then from there, why would the Viking people show up there? What would happen when they came together? And that whole story kind of formed around that idea. So every novel has been different. The Crimson Sand, Crimson Snow also came from, literally, I was at a wedding in Vermont, and it was an outdoor wedding, and I looked over at this field and I thought that field would be awesome if there was like a big giant war horse charging at us right now over that field. That would be phenomenal. And that image ended up in the book because I really wanted to kind of try to describe what I saw in my imagination that afternoon.
Right.
So it comes from all over the place.
There's a million bits to pick out of that answer, and most importantly for me, to go off script, because I know how much that really screws around Brandon's plans. So I'm going. So taking a step back to, you talked about the space opera, 80,000 word comedy into an 140,000 word something a lot more serious.
Yeah.
So we've spoken in the past about the planning process. Really, really oversimplifying. If you were to put it into one or two ways, you can either come up with a rough plan, accepting you will do a ton of rewrites, or you can spend ages planning it to the nth degree and write it in one go because you've got everything figured out already.
Yeah.
Does that mean then that by and large you go for sort of plan A, as in you get a rough plan, you'll write it, and you'll see where it goes during that process?
That is a phenomenal question. And you would think that from what I just said, but that would actually be, I spend so much time on my outlines so that when I'm writing, if I get writer's block, it won't affect me as much because most of the bits and pieces have already been put in place. So you're exactly right. I have tried with short stories to do it without an outline, and I've never been happy with the result. As you say, it's rewrite after rewrite after rewrite, trying to put everything in line with everything else. And so I work off of a very elaborate outline. And so when I say that I was working with this, what was going to be a buddy comedy, happy-go-lucky little sci-fi, what kept happening instead was the outline kept going askew. And as I was building the world, bits and pieces that would intrigue me would actually drag me in a totally different direction than the one I was anticipating. So, for instance, trying to come up with, I didn't really want to get into the politics of the galaxy, but I started thinking, I think I heard the phrase at one point, the dangers of democracy would be two wolves and a sheep voting on who gets to be eaten for lunch.
Interesting.
And so literally that sentence kind of ended up getting embedded in this galactic government. And once you have a government that is clothing itself in the trappings of democracy, but really brutalizing the minorities, not the minority, people, but the galactic cultures that aren't as strong or as powerful or as numerous, that really kind of pulls you away from the comedy aspect of everything.
That's true.
And so what happened so the derailing really happened in the background writing and in the outline writing phase. That was a great question.
Yeah, I'll hand you back to Brandon. Before I do, I'll just say that you did say it was a phenomenal question, and as we're approaching pay review season at Winged Hussar as an independent contractor, I thought I'd point that out and emphasize that.
Don't worry. Go ahead, Craig.
You want to mark that so you can use it as a clip. Go right ahead.
I was just saying, I've made a mark in his permanent file in red pen, so we'll review this later.
Excellent. Brandon, all of your questions have been great too.
Yeah, It's a little too late, Craig. I'll just deal with it. So, one of the things, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'll go in a little bit more depth now. One of the things we talk about a lot is IP writing, or for our listeners, I just want to reiterate, intellectual property writing. We write in a lot of different gaming universes. We work with different companies and write novels to flesh out their gaming worlds. Craig, you've written both IP-based novels and standalone original novels. Which do you prefer and why?
The second. Next question. Oh, just kidding.
It just didn't meet that standard.
It all depends.
I'm sorry.
I've had a great time writing in both, to be honest.
Yeah.
From the theater background, I love collaboration. So I love being in a collaborative environment where ideas are just bouncing off over everything, and we're working that way.
Right.
But on the other side, I really love the freedom of, what would normally happen in one of my independent novels is I come up with the outline, I send it to you guys, and you guys kind of like help me with some guardrails maybe and be like, oh, that looks cool, or what about this? And then I'm off to the races.
Right.
I will say, like, I'm all about positivity, but having spent years working for Fantasy Flight and having all of those books there's a cardboard box in my attic right now just of the books that I am in for them. That's too heavy to lift because the bottom will bust out of it. And all of that is like, well, to paraphrase, all of that is gone like tears in the rain,
Yep.
They lost that IP. All of those books disappear. All of that work is now nothing, basically. Nobody's going to read it. It basically doesn't exist anymore. And that kind of stung, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. And something similar happened with Wild West Exodus when Wild West Exodus was bought.
Absolutely.
And there's no bad guys in the story, but it was bought by a UK company, and the UK company wanted to go in a different direction, which is absolutely their right when they spend that kind of money. And so there are 5 novels that, aren't aligned now with the fluff of the game. The last 2 that I wrote, I rewrote for them with their new fluff so that it could be in line, but they haven't done anything with that, which again is 100% their prerogative.
Right.
But that was 5 novels of work, which would, at that point, I was generating a lot more work back then. That was before my son was born. And I think, or around the time, like he was young and my wife was doing most of the work at that point.
Yeah, I think I think he was born by that point.
Yeah, I think you're right. But like I said, Karen was doing most of the work. And she was like, oh my God, you're actually going to be a writer. That's great. And was letting me like live that dream.
Yeah.
And I would say I was probably writing 2 novels a year at that point. So you're talking about 3 or 4 years worth of work. And again, those novels still exist. You can go get them. But the intention of that being an introduction to a whole big developing world didn't really play out. And so it wasn't as bad as the Fantasy Flight books all kind of getting just washed away from the universe. But at the same time, it was like, I put a lot of work into, if you include the work of all the fluff and the faction work and the character, the character bios and everything in the various rule books, that probably added up to another 2 or 3 books worth of words. So there was a lot of time and effort, and my life,
Absolutely.
Of summers spent in the basement instead of doing other things. And it's kind of like gone, So in that regard, I vastly prefer to write my own stories so that they're less likely to be impacted by the vagaries of business decisions and things like that. Everything can get wiped out in a heartbeat, but if it's my story, then it's less likely that some business decision somewhere far away that I have nothing to do with, if it's a good story, is going to kind of erase it or make it invalid or make it harder to get and whatnot. So I would say in the action of writing, I love both. But in the long run, I feel more reward and more comfort and more security in doing my own stuff.
Yeah, we've had a whole episode devoted to writing in the IP setting and writing original novels. And that's one of the things we talked about is, what happens when an IP dies and, things like this happen. Because we've had that happen twice now where Wild West Exodus changed hands.
Yeah.
And then Beyond the Gates of Antares stopped being mass-produced by Warlord.
Yeah.
So we had 2 of our series kind of go to the wayside, and both you and Mark have experience with dealing with that.
Yep.
And, I'll put it as a little background information for our listeners to get some behind-the-scenes stuff, but I remember we finished, I think it was the last draft of Family Blood 2 when we were ready to go to print with it. Like, there is a full book you have written. It's done. We worked really hard to get it done, just like we do on any other book. Mm-hmm. It's done, and we can't do anything with it. And again, it's no fault to anybody.
No.
But we weren't, like, none of us were told until it happened because of NDAs and blah, 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 blah. But it was just like, the news dropped, and we were just like, well, what do we do with this book that's done now? We just can't do it. So it's definitely an interesting subject because I kind of see, like, all of our books stand on their own as terrific writing jobs. Like, all of our authors put blood, sweat, and tears into it. You know, me as the editor, I put blood, sweat, and tears into making it the best possible product it can be. But at the end of the day, with the IP novels specifically, you have to look at it in a vein of, just like anything with life, it's not. There's a finite time on it.
Yeah,
you know,
and
there's no guarantee.
It's not yours. You know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a good CV builder, and it's good to put on your resume to say that I wrote books for this game and I did this. But then, the ultimate goal is you want to try to transition into your own writing and take the skills and the knowledge you've learned in writing in those settings and create your own universe and your own novel. So it's definitely an interesting topic, and we can go on and on talking about that.
Well, the Family Blood 2, just one more time, because that's the one that's just kind of like sitting there in my head. I wrote that one twice because we wrote it.
Yes.
We wrote it and we did it. And then they came in and they changed all the factions, and they had the kits. They had, at that point in the history of the game, they had to stick with the models that they had. But they decided to shift all the factions around, and they shifted the background around, and the big bad guys were no longer existing, and they were somebody new. And so I had to go in and take an existing novel and rearrange everything inside it so that it now aligned with a whole new worldview, and connections were like, there were no longer connections to one set of factions because those factions no longer existed, or they were now wildly changed. And I had to go back and reattach all those different characters and plot points to different factions with enough knowledge, with enough information and background, and try not to info dump, but try to get enough, of a flavor of those factions so that you felt like it was an introduction to a new world, when in fact it was the sixth or seventh book in the Wild West Exodus series.
Yep.
Yeah. So it was interesting. And then the decision was made to kind of like set that aside for the time being. And every now and then I'll get an email and, we're still thinking about it, and which is great. But in my head, I've kind of written it off.
Yeah. I was gonna say, you've moved on. There's been lots of time for you to work on other projects.
Exactly.
Like Infinity and Blood and Plunder and your own standalone. There's lots of things going on with you.
Yeah, there is.
Speaking of which, I mean, it's almost like you've segued that into a rough kind of list of questions we got here, which I'm now going to subtly rewrite because you mentioned Blood and Plunder. So we were going to talk about the difference between sci-fi and fantasy because you've done a ton of both, but you also mentioned Blood and Plunder, which I'm a recent convert to. And one of the things I absolutely love about Blood and Plunder is I have absolutely nothing to do with it, so I can just enjoy it for what it is instead of... Yeah, because any games that you get involved in, and that's probably a separate question. I when I was writing rules for Warlord, I'd kind of play stuff and go, geez, is there anything I can do to tweak this? When you start to do lore for Kings of War, Infinity, whatever it is. But Blood and Plunder, I can just play it and check my brain in at the door. It's great. But enough about me, about you. So sci-fi fantasy. Sci-fi fantasy and Blood and Plunder is actually historic.
Yes.
So of those three, which of those genres, if you had to put them in order, in pecking order of, you've got to stick your colours to a mast, what would your pecking order be of? You've got to commit to writing novels in those three. Which would be your favourite and your least favourite, and why?
So if you're like, gun to my head, hypothetical universe where I could only do one, it would have to be sci-fi. Because in my mind, I can make a sci-fi into fantasy, right? Depending on the level of technology and the angle that I want to take. and I can inspire. So this is a bit of a cheat answer, actually, because sci-fi, I can do almost anything. I can I can map it on a historical event. But to take your question at face value, it would be sci-fi and probably then fantasy and then probably then history. But I would never want to live in a world where I had to only do one.
Well, to compound off of that, our last interview, I was talking with Scott Washburn, and he said fantasy and sci-fi are kind of under the same umbrella nowadays, and people refer to it as speculative fiction. And I think nowadays it kind of they are hand in hand, and it's just one is based more in futuristic with science, and the other one is with magic. And to go off on another thing you said, I've realized lately, and mostly this is from just the different games I've played, science fiction, there's so much room to expand.
Yeah.
When you use the universe as your backdrop, it's endless. Okay, you've done your whole story on this planet, go to another planet. But in fantasy, you've got, typically you have your continent that the story takes place on, or you have multiple continents, but it's only as finite as that world you've created. Now, you could do portal shenanigans and time-jumping shenanigans to expand out that world, but I really feel like sci-fi is much more limitless in its potential.
My gut reaction to that statement is that no one has ever written a book that has fully explored one world.
That's true too, though.
So
yeah,
if you look at Terry Pratchett, one of my, if not my 100% all-time greatest hero. All of his there's got to be over 40 Discworld novels, right? And he just barely scratched the surface of the first turtle, because it's turtles all the way down. So I totally get what you're saying, but I think it all depends on the focal length of your lens. You can spend an entire career like Terry Pratchett did on a single world and find a million different places to go and people to see and cultures, whereas you could write a single novel in science fiction and visit a million worlds, but you're just touching on each one, right? And as far as science fiction, I love Star Wars, and I'll just say that. But the thing that I find most intriguing about science fiction is that we are all just accepting of the fact that although we know that every planet has to have countless biodomes in it, Hoth is all frozen. And
that's true.
Dagobah is all a swamp. And and this idea that these planets are monolithic in their terrain and in their architecture. And so I think that there's a kind of a habit, and I blame Star Wars a little bit and Star Trek and all of all the big IPs that have kind of formed the major consciousness of popular culture, with this idea that you can hip hop across the galaxy and go to this one sunny place and this one beachy place and then this one frozen place. Whereas if I wanted to write a fantasy, I could go to a beach and then so
yeah,
I think the limitations aren't so much in whether you're doing science fiction or fantasy. It's on your chosen focus, really, as an author.
It's a great answer.
Do you want to expand and visit a bunch of culture? I mean, if you look at, A Song of Ice and Fire, you've got a bunch of books that are focused on one relatively small island with 7 kingdoms on it, and then the whole world blows out and you start visiting other places and you're like, oh wow, Westeros is such a small part of this world that most people think it's just a barbaric backwater, but you spent the first 2 or 3 books doing nothing but learning about that. So I think you can sort of constantly explore and expand. And I don't think anyone has ever in their career that I know of exhausted the one world they wanted to focus on, if that makes sense.
That's an excellent answer. I love that thought.
To dive in on that, and I'll mention the word history because that then gives Brandon a coffee break because history is not his thing.
I'll step out of the room, but yeah,
Yeah, he sent me a message on on Facebook Messenger and said, "Bring up history. I want a coffee." So he didn't. So Blood and Plunder is a really interesting one because of the era it's in and in terms of researching it. So before I started, because let's bring it back to me. And talk
absolutely.
about me. That's why we're all here.
You're
really.
a fascinating gentleman. We should focus more on you.
I like to think so. So before I started writing for WHP, all of the stuff I had done was factual stuff. World Wars One, World Wars Two, and that is an area where there is an abundance of history written there. And even for World War Two, I was lucky enough to interview veterans and get first-hand recollections.
Oh wow!
But for you in Blood and Plunder, we're talking about 1600s, 1700s.
Yeah.
And in terms of, say, the golden age of piracy, the number one source is Captain Johnson's A History of Pirates, which historians still debate on, is it a fantastic source or is it all but a complete work of fiction? And we still haven't settled on that. So for writing for Blood and Plunder, which is history, but where it is really difficult to get the historical facts in compared to a lot of other areas, how did you find that compared to sci-fi and fantasy, where if you make not a mistake, you've got more, I think, wriggle room in sci-fi and fantasy to say, I've done this.
Absolutely.
And then someone will come back and go, hang on, that's not right. And you go, what do you mean it's not right? It's make-believe. It can be what I want it to be as long as I justify it. But history, you can't do that. You've got to get everything right. You've got to get the right type of toothpaste, everything. So how did you find that for Blood and Plunder?
Well, that's just another excellent question, Mark. Really?
Thanks. And as we approach contract to pay review, that's a great thing for you to say. Thank you.
Listen, you need to stop one-upping me.
No. Your last question was great. All of your guys, I can't tell you how long it's been since so many amazing questions have been tossed at me at the same time in one interview.
Listen, before at the end of every interview, we do a tally mark, and whoever gets the most, that was a great question, wins a Ferrari, according to Mark.
Oh, cool. I want to ride one day.
There's a story behind that.
So anyway, to get back to your amazingly awesome question, absolutely, writing historical fiction is completely different, as you know, having to research all of the rule books and things that you've worked on. I'm going to make an admission now, and it's going to be shameless. And so Blood and Plunder has some great rule books out. And Mike and the boys over there put together some fantastic historical blurbs sewn throughout, including a timeline in the front of the first hardcover rulebook that ever came out for Blood and Plunder. And their historical advisor was the historical advisor on the Black Sails TV show. Wow. So, which I'm sure was not entirely historically accurate, but was awesome nonetheless. And so I leaned heavily into their rule book. And so I picked a time period in their time flow. I made sure that it lined up with where they said different people were at different times. And then I did most of my exhaustive research. I love ships. I love boats. My family owned a boat for most of 20 years on a big lake up here in New Hampshire, but it wasn't a sailboat. And I don't know very much about sailing. I love being on sailboats and sailing ships, but I don't know about, much about it. So that's where most of my non-historical timeline research went into. And so I had to find, what's a brig versus a brigantine, for instance. And I also used the Blood and Plunder rules to make sure that I was referencing ships and ship types that they had rules for, so that someone who's following along reading the book and who likes the game is going to be able to kind of put things in perspective and remember, oh, so that's the big one and that's a little one, but at the same time wanted to make sure that they were all aligned together. And another thing that I had to actually research quite heavily was one of my main characters in For Jamaica, which is the book for Blood and Plunder, was an Irish captain who had fled what's that guy? It's crazy. Mark, I'm going to lean on you a little bit here. So the Lord Protector of England was who?
Lord Protect. Are we talking about Oliver Cromwell?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Whew.
Yeah, that was good right off the bat. I'm sorry to put you on the spot,
yeah.
but you acquitted yourself quite well. I'm
you.
Fascinated with
pay
Oliver
review season,
Cromwell, but
good.
at the same time, I can never remember his name. And so, yeah, so and so that I don't think it was actually his conquest of Ireland, but there were wars throughout Ireland where Britain and Ireland were fighting. And I had to research that whole time period because what I wanted was a character who had been pivotal in some of the lesser known sea battles revolving around the ultimate conquering of Ireland. And he had basically fled the last big battle with his ship, and now he was a pirate with that ship in the Caribbean. And so I researched that pretty exhaustively. Obviously, I don't remember anything about it now, but it's all in the book as sort of like background and bedrock of that character of Eamon was his name. And that's the sort of like the main character ship is his ship, the Bonnie Kate, and his background is this sea captain who was fighting for the independence of Ireland, or defending the independence of Ireland, and ultimately fled when the Irish government collapsed. So there was a lot of research that went into sort of like outside of the rule book. But for the most part, I leaned heavily on the rule book and the research that had already been done for that. Although, little side note, I wrote the whole book and I didn't bring any real historical people into the book as main characters, but they're referenced here or there as people who, well, everybody knows that guy does this, or everybody knows that guy's over there. And I wrote the whole thing, and the outline was historically accurate, but as I wrote it, the story got away from me, and I only realized it in editing that I had a real historical character in the Caribbean who was actually being tried for piracy in London that year. So
geez.
I had to go back and be like, is it a different person? Do I have to change the whole, the whole timeline of the book? But ultimately I figured it out. But that was like somebody's going to know that so-and-so isn't in the Caribbean when I say he's in the Caribbean.
Oh, sounds fantastic. But I think that raises a really interesting point on piracy. You mentioned that as this is a theme in this story.
Yeah.
So you go, okay, so why is character A, our lead protagonist, a pirate? Well, he wants money, and he's quite happy to do criminal stuff. But instead, you've got here researching the real world politics behind, and again, you pick any famous pirate from history, Blackbeard, any of them. There are geopolitical reasons which start the chain of events into why nearly all of these individuals ended up doing what they did. And by doing that, you've A, done that, and B, you've made it different from all of the famous pirates who...
Right.
I mean, is your guy getting tried in London, was it Captain Kidd?
I think it was.
Yeah. So again, there's geopolitical reasons into why Captain Kidd went from being a privateer to a pirate and so on and so forth. So yeah, no, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah,
that's a very good answer. I'd say a phenomenal answer.
Thank you.
Well, while we're at pay review territory, a phenomenal answer.
And that touches on something that's really core to my writing, is that no bad guy is the bad guy of their own story. And that goes for anti-heroes that you're writing also, right? So
absolutely,
like you just said, nobody's a pirate just because they have no morals and they want money. There's always going to be a story. And if you're talking the larger the ego, the more they feel that they are the hero of their own story, right? And so that's always, to me, fundamental of any villain that I'm writing, but any character. I try to make I try for none of my characters to be, perfect paragons of virtue and talent, and so everybody's got their flaws and their problems and their issues. but it goes back to my awakening of stories and reading books in, high school and before. And the books where the bad guy was as compelling, if not more compelling, than the main heroes are really the ones that I gravitated towards. And people who were evil just for the sake of evil. Lord of the Rings, notwithstanding. Because if you look at Lord of the Rings, there are people who become bad who are then good again or have a redemptive arc, even though the main bad guy is bad because he's bad. But for the most part, my favorite stories are those where the bad guy has at least as compelling a story. And one of the big roles that I played in my career was Macbeth. And I think that really, I was young when I did it. And that was really my awakening in my own mind to any bad guy I ever write has to have a story, even though it's not the story everyone else is living. They have to have a story where they're the hero.
Absolutely. That really adds a lot of depth to the characters and makes it more compelling.
Right.
Yeah, I really want to dive into Macbeth now because I studied it at school and it'll make me look really intellectual because I can actually talk about that. But instead, I'll hand you over to Brandon for the next question.
And you and I will just take it as a given that we're both well-read intellectuals.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't worry about me. I'm not included in that conversation. So
you could have
I'm on the
easily
lesser
jumped
spectrum.
in at any time.
No.
You're also
I'll be the
facilitator.
excluded
You're
one.
the facilitator. It's okay. This couldn't be happening without you.
Yes, true. Good humor. I love good humor. Today's episode is sponsored by On Military Matters, your source for new, used, and out-of-print books on military history, wargaming, and modeling. Check them out at onmilitarymatters.com and make sure to sign up for the weekly e-flyer. And so, Craig, I have my other new favorite question I want to ask you.
Okay, you're full of favorite questions, Brandon. It's great.
It's exciting. I have all these thoughts, and I'm just like, you know what? If I like this, maybe the listeners will like this, and behind the scenes stuff. Let you guys really get your creative juices flowing.
Exactly.
And talk about it. But this is multi-layered, so bear with me.
Okay.
I want to know, who is your favorite and least favorite character in the works that you've written? Now, I'm not talking about writing, just as a character. Who are your favorite and least favorite? And then, who was the most fun to write, and who was the most challenging?
That's tough. That's actually not a good question. I literally have thesaurus.com up right now so that I can tell you in so many different words how awesome that question was. And that question's just not awesome, Brandon. It's mean.
Like, you have to think a little bit?
No, because it's like you're choosing which child do you really dislike? Which of your children are you not proud of? And then which one would you rather take to McDonald's while the others are left home crying, eating cold mac and cheese?
Well, this is kind of like, have you ever written a character where you're like,
yeah, no, I get it.
It serves a purpose.
Is a joke. Is humor.
I know.
Wait.
Like I said, I like the good humor. It's good. I like the laugh.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. It's in fact, I would argue that question was amazing and astonishing while being at the same time astounding and awe-inspiring. I found it breathtaking, imposing, a little bit imposing, inspiring. I want to really do this question justice. It was magnificent and majestic while at the same time miraculous, coming from a man who is just such an everyman at the same time. It was spectacular, staggering. I'm a little wondering how I'm going to do it justice. It's so amazing and stunning. I'm stupefied. It was sublime in so many ways I can't even describe. I found it wonderful, and just to sum it all up in one word, wondrous.
I just want to thank you because I did hear you typing on the keyboard right before
yeah,
the answer.
That's an unfortunate side effect of recording with the laptop. So anyway, who did I like the least? That's an easy one. I hated writing Ulysses S. Grant for all of the everywhere he showed up in Wild West Exodus.
Interesting.
His like each one of them had a novella. So there were 4 factions at the beginning, and each faction had sort of their main signature figure that was going to lead their starter box, and those characters each got like a novella in the big rule book. And his novella, the story, the outline was great. I still to this day I love the idea of the story, the outline. The storyline kind of takes world history and then deviates at the middle at the Civil War. And so I really liked the way I was able to weave each of these characters into that time frame. But writing him was agonizing. And one of the most humbling moments of all of the writing that I've done was me admitting that to somebody and them going, "Oh yeah, no, that wasn't very good."
Jeez.
And I was like, "That's not what I said. I didn't say it wasn't very good. I said it was hard." And this person took that as an invitation to be like, "Oh yeah, no, that part of your writing was just not very good." So
that's terrible, because I actually really enjoyed your writing of him.
Well, thank you. That you just did a little bit of work taking the sting out of that memory. But ultimately, that happened years after I wrote all of that stuff. So that wasn't why I didn't like it. I just, for some reason, I found him difficult. I find him fascinating in real life. I find him completely compelling. I think having a character that's just a genius general but a political idiot would be a great combination to kind of fold into a great story. But for some reason, writing him for Wild West Exodus just never gelled for me. And so every time I knew he was going to be coming into a story, I approached it with trepidation, and I was very nervous about how I was going to make that work. So that would be my least favorite. My most favorite, I don't know that I can do like. I love from Crimson Sand, Crimson Snow. Eric Hastine I loved writing him. So
yep.
The youngest member to his king's personal guard. Then the king's personal guard gets, cat's pawed, and they all get wiped out except for him through a fluke. And because he's the only one who survives, nobody believes that he wasn't in on the ambush, and he flees the kingdom and becomes almost like a carnival act out in the hinterlands. And he becomes a drunk as he's trying to hide from his past. And I really enjoyed that character because I felt like there was so much human weakness, but at the same time, like a kernel of goodness in that guy. And ultimately the battle in him between the shame that he was feeling that was clearly not valid because he didn't do anything wrong, but between his own, self-imposed morality and the culture that he was in. He was from that Viking aspect of the book. He ultimately has to make his own choices and decide whether he's going to, overcome all of the baggage that he's been carrying. By the time the book starts, he's in his 40s. So he was in his late teens when this event happened. And now he's got decades of just, dragging all of this shame and everything around with him. So I really, really enjoyed writing him. And then what was the third part of the question was which character do I like the most as a character?
Yeah.
That's a tough one. As a character, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I ended up really liking Declan in Team Zed's shell game, and I'll just leave it at that because that's emotionally harrowing.
That's something we're going to talk about in the next episode.
Yeah.
Right. So moving on then. So on that, on the subject of what you've been talking about in terms of some of the trials and pitfalls that you found with 12 years of writing now.
Yeah.
let's say you've got a new author so completely unpublished new author comes to you and they're trying to break into franchise writing, into sci-fi and fantasy. And furthermore, let's say it's one of the 50% of unpublished authors who are open to advice from people who have actually done it before.
50% seems a bit high.
I've been lucky. I've been really lucky.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad for you.
Yeah. Thank you. So, yeah, what would your kind of top tips and big headline advice be for someone who hasn't done this before but really wants to get into it to kind of learn from your experiences?
It would be, first of all, to understand that working in an IP is absolutely a collaborative effort. I can't tell you how many people have approached me, probably because of the podcast. My audience for people hearing me talk about writing is a lot broader than some people might be. So I get a lot more people coming to me, and everyone's got this genius idea for a novel, but like, how should they start out? And first of all, I don't even know how to start out there, because I just kind of like it all comes down to networking for me. And I, met all of these different people through the podcast. So I would say, number one, you need to be out there. You need to be in whatever communities you're looking to write for, and be open to making these contacts. And then you have to understand that it's a collaborative effort. It's a team effort. You're going to be working with people who not only own the characters that you're writing, they own the world that you're writing in, and they have, and rightfully so, a deep and abiding sense of ownership in all of that. And so they're literally handing you their children, saying, do something fun with my kids for the day. And you have to respect that. You have to work within the parameters of what they're trying to do with whatever story, whether it's a short story, whether it's a blurb in a rule book, or a full-length novel. You have to understand, or the way I approach it is I try to get out of them, what do you want to do? Do you want to showcase new armies? Do you want to showcase particular models? Is it an overview of the world? Am I hiding a travelogue inside the story so that you want me to visit as many different places? And then I'm trying to constantly please those people. So it's a collaborative effort. And yes, there's a lot of creativity in that. And I get a great sense of satisfaction from coming up with my own spin on all of these different things, but you're working in somebody else's playground, and you have to understand that. The other piece of business advice I would give a person is you need to respect your own efforts, because there's a lot of bootstrap companies out there, especially in the gaming world, that are trying to get their stuff out to the world, understandably, and they want to try to do it with as little expenditure on their end as possible, understandably. And so there's a lot of people who don't really appreciate how much time and effort goes into good writing. So they'll do things like offer you like, oh, hey, write this short story for my rule book and I'll give you $100 in product, right? And that is not showing your talent respect. You have to have the confidence in your own work to say, I work for money, and that's why I work, and that's what I'm trying to do. And there's all kind, you can do fan fiction, you can do, battle reports online or on YouTube or whatever, and that's great. Get your work, get your name out there. But when you start tying yourself to a specific company, don't be a stooge for that company. Don't be like, you want to be a member of the team. You want to be a valued member of the team. And if they value you, they're going to pay you. They're not going to give you what amount, so if they let's talk business for a second, right? If this company who's making their own product gives you $100 worth of product retail, that's most likely less than $40 for them, probably even less than that if they've built in a margin for it going to retail instead of selling direct to consumer. And so that your value at that point is being more than halved, and you don't have cash. You don't have the ability to take that reward and do with it what you want, which should be things like paying bills, keeping the lights on, making your life better. That's why you're doing this. If you're writing just to get your words out in front of other people, that's cool. Go in knowing that's what you're doing, though. If you want to do this for a living, if you want to make this a career, or even like most of us do, like the people who can do this for a career are few and far between. Most of us have one or more other jobs that we're doing at the same time. So personally, you have to pay me enough to make it worth my while that I'm down here in the basement, although it's a very nice basement, finished like an Irish pub, I might add. I'm down here instead of being out there playing with my son or going skiing or going golfing, and so you have to value your skill, your ability, your time as highly as you can, and as the market will bear. So you hear all the time, like, oh yeah, no, I did a short story for so-and-so. Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Yeah, they gave me, a free rule book. Well, that should be right up front. You should be getting, if you're writing for that rule book, that should be included almost for free in whatever you're doing. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you need to value yourself. You have to have, even if you don't have confidence, you have to fake it, which you can. That's the great thing about confidence. If you fake it, nobody knows. So that's what I would say my advice would be. I prattle.
No, that's great.
I
That's
thought it was a
actually
good answer.
That's probably some of the best advice we've gotten. We've had a few authors on already, and everybody's given different shades of advice. But that's the business part of it. I think you've had the most experience than everybody else on the show because of how, like Mark said,
I've been at this a long time, Brandon.
So that's a shade of advice we haven't gotten from anybody else.
It's interesting to me because the scenario you described there of working for, say, store credit on an online shop for an IP or for payment, that's not like this might end up coming your way. I'd say for anyone getting into the genre, it is almost undoubtedly going to happen.
Yep.
I've had the scenario you've described there. I've lost count of how many times that's cropped up.
Yep.
So,
it's very, very common.
It's a really valid one to bring up. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's understandable from their point of view, right? But ultimately, if you want to have your rule book have good writing in it, you have to pay somebody to do that writing. You're not as much as it would be cool if you could get it for free, and you could fool somebody into doing it for free once or twice. If for practically for free, if you want it in your rule book, you should really be paying for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't know. Everyone will have their own different cutoffs, but for me, if it's going to be contributing to something which is going to go on sale retail, then I'd expect to be paid for the service. Yep. If it's something that is in indirect support, so like it's going to go on their blog, and it's going to go just an article on their website, a little kind of attention piece, then I think for me that'd be like, okay, fair enough, a little bit of store credit or a goodie box in the post, something like that would be fine for me. But everyone's got their own different cutoff.
No, I think that's a very healthy and common sense cutoff point. Would be if they're planning on directly profiting from it, then you should too.
Yeah, that's it. It sounds. I think for anyone outside looking in, it can sound a bit cutthroat, but ultimately, it is. It's a profit-making industry, the same as anything else.
Yeah, and you have to understand. Like, yes, would it be awesome if everybody could do everything, and we all just got a basic living stipend to live in the Federation, and you could join Starfleet if you want? Yeah, that'd be great. But that's not the world we live in, and currently that wouldn't work. So. We're living in a world where in order for you to succeed or advance, you have to add value to whatever it is you're doing. So if you're adding value, you should benefit from that.
Agreed.
So we spoke a lot about all the writing stuff that you've been involved in, but it doesn't just end there for multi-talented Craig. So the D6 generation side of things, can you go into, please, a little bit of how that got started, what the process has been, and where you guys are up to with it at the moment?
Well, that is a loaded question, and you had no way of knowing that. But very quickly, my really good friends Russ and Rafe, who I've known for decades, The three of us were going to a local con in February of 2008. It used to be called TempleCon. It now since has changed to Captain Con. It's in Rhode Island, but it's still going strong. On the road, it's like an hour and a half drive down. So on the hour and a half drive down, Russ said, so I've been chatting with Rafe, and there's this new thing called a podcast, and we want you to help us do it. And then they made me listen to a little bit of I can't remember what it was. It was a Warhammer fantasy podcast. I'm doing the guy a grave disservice not remembering his name or the name of the podcast, but he was phenomenal. He was great. His podcast was fun to listen to. And when we started, he became a good friend of ours and was helping us with advice. And so I said yes. And so the very next month, we started recording. And we recorded right up until today, gentlemen. So let's break some news. The D6 generation has sadly closed its doors.
Really?
No.
So at our heyday, we had about 30,000 downloads per episode, which for podcasts that aren't, headlined by Hollywood superhero types is a great number. But it took a lot of time and effort. For about 10 years, we put out, with very few breaks, a 4-hour plus podcast every other week. So we were... The podcast structure was multiple shows, not multiple shows, but multiple segments that were set up like different shows. So it started with a skit that I had to write every other week. And then it had different segments, 2 major segments, several minor segments. It ended with an editorial commentary on gaming culture and geek culture that I wrote and delivered every other week. And it was a lot of work, and it was awesome, and it brought a lot of great things to my life, like I've said already, and it brought a lot of great things to Rafe and Russ's life, brought us all around the world, brought us to England once, even all over the country and to England once. But it was just too much. Once your children get to a certain age, you just can't foist the whole thing off on your wife, it turns out. And so I had to pull back a little bit. Russ had to pull back a little bit. And then Rafe pulled back. Actually, it was Rafe pulled back, and then I pulled back, and then Russ pulled back. Then we were doing like one segment every now and then. In 2018, we started to fade out a little bit, but our numbers were still really good. And we literally just went for the last 10 years, we end the year with a predictions episode where we predict each of us predict 7 events that we think is going to happen in the next year between gaming and entertainment and our own lives. And those are the biggest episodes always. And we just did our last one, and it went live today when we're recording this. So it's a kind of a bittersweet day, but it's been great. We're going to leave all the content out there. It had a no hate foundation from the very beginning. So we never complained. We never bought into any kind of negativity from any of the communities that we touched on. The interviews that you can find there, we've interviewed Rick Priestley. We've interviewed Matt Wilson from War Machine. I can't remember the company that makes War Machine at the moment, but
you recently had us on.
Yeah, a bunch. We had you guys on a bunch. In fact, Winged Hussar Vince was a great friend of the show for a very long time. And became one of our early advertisers for a long, long time. Went back when we had advertising before we went to a Patreon model. And so the show was great. David Weber, who wrote all the Honor Harrington books, was on our show several times. And in fact, there was going to be an Honor Harrington TV show. And when they were working towards that, we actually did an amazing one of the big highlights for me through the entire 15 years that we did it, ultimately, because we kind of faded in and out these last 5, was we actually interviewed David Weber and the entire production team of the TV show pilot they were making. They were in Hollywood in a big conference room, and we teleconferenced in with them for that episode.
Wow.
So we literally were teleconferencing in, just like you see in the movies and in TV shows. They were in this huge all glass conference room, and Russ and I were in a basement with our faces squished together so the laptop camera could catch us both, and our big fat faces were on a giant 80-inch screen in their room, and we were just looking out. It was just awesome. So all of those episodes are out there if you're interested in getting into writing. I mean, he's a New York Times bestselling author, won all kinds of awards. We've had famous actors on, and it was great. It was a great, great, great opportunity and an amazing adventure. It was time. It was time, really. We couldn't maintain it without putting in more work and effort and time than we could afford. So it was awesome. It was just a phenomenal, chapter in my life, and I'm sad that it's over, but it was time. So we just announced it ourselves and launched that last episode this morning at 7, and right now it's 10:22. So it is technically breaking news.
Oh man, I did not know that was going to be the answer
Nobody
to that
did.
question at all. Genuinely,
Nobody
yeah,
did.
that is crazy. I think I don't think it's been too trite to say on behalf of kind of the whole gaming community that I'm sure a ton of people are going to be sorry to hear that, and a ton of people are really thankful for what you guys did for that. It's understandable, everything you've explained as to why sometimes you get to the point. Well, you said pull the plug, maybe just press pause. Who knows? You could always double back to these things if things changes. Yep. You never know. So yeah, just myself and Brandon have been on podcasts and stuff, but I think it's only in the last few weeks we've both found out more firsthand the phenomenal amount of hours that go into producing an output which is a much smaller proportion in terms of timing once you click on it.
Yeah.
So for what you guys have done to be churning out that work rate and that output rate is commendable, and thanks so much for everything you did. And sorry to hear that at the moment it's postponed indefinitely.
Yeah.
Well, and
if it says optimistically.
If I can add just a little bit of humor for a moment.
Yeah.
Did you come on the show to basically just tell us that Craig Gallant has become the hottest new free agent in podcasting? Or do you have to twist your arm here?
Absolutely.
I was totally thinking that, but thought, no, I'm not gonna ask him to work for us.
No, I mean, to be honest, over the last 2 years, the agreement that the three of us had was each one of us had to come up with 8 30-minute segments. So I haven't put nearly as much work into it over the last few years as I used to. So it's not like a big giant hole in my schedule has just opened up. But no, it was great. It was awesome, and you have to end things to make room for new things, and that's kind of what I'm looking at this as. But as far as its effect on my writing and the IPs that I've worked on, like I said before, it's I never would be writing, I don't think, if it wasn't for the podcast. And Neil at Spartan Games reached out to me because I said I want to write one day, and so that started. And then all the guys over at Fantasy Flight. And then Romeo, because he was an advertiser. He was I think he might have been the first advertiser that we had. It would either be him or Terrace at Geek Nation Tours. Those two
Terrace
were both roughly at the same time. And so I've known those guys for, all probably close to 15 years now. And at the same time, that the D6 generation, I don't know if I would have played half as many games as I ended up playing, collecting half as many miniatures armies as I collected. I went from, really Games Workshop was the only thing. I was playing 40K and I had a couple fantasy armies, and Russ and Rafe had just started. They loved everything about the Iron Kingdoms and War Machine. So those very early episodes are very much GW versus War Machine in a friendly way. Like I said, one of the things that we kept hearing from other people who had podcasts was that their fan base became toxic, and gamers in general, or at least the ones who interact online, are mostly awesome people. But there are some, keyboard warriors who get on there and they decide to stake their claim and fly their flag and attack anybody who comes near them. And so you get really, really angry, nasty, negative comment sections and things like that. And the slightest negativity in your podcast will then be latched on by that community and start to spill over into the rest of the interactions that you have. So you've had people who've just shut off their comment sections and they don't listen, don't answer their emails. From the very first episode, we had our no hate policy. So if we didn't like something, we would say, we are very disappointed in this product, and we wouldn't say anything more about it, and we would move on. And we never had any of that negativity in our fan base, in our emails, in our comment sections. We ended up, some of the great things, we would go to Gen Con and we would have events with over 100 people sitting in a big room at who would think that you would want to go all the way to Indianapolis to the biggest game convention in the country and spend an hour and a half watching these three jamokes from New Hampshire? But people would do it. It was every fan interaction I've ever had has been positive. Like I said, there's never been negativity. And I think from the very beginning, it was because, and I give all this credit to Russ, even when we were talking about we love the, War Machine. And I'm like, I'm really disappointed in War Machine. I'm disappointed that my friends aren't playing 40K anymore. It was always spun in that more positive framework. And I would say extend that out to real life and any effort that you do that touches any online community. The minute you say something negative, it's going to be latched on by a vocal minority, and they're going to become the apparent majority of your interactions. And so I don't interact with any kind of negativity online, and I don't produce it, and I keep my public comments positive. And I think that is if I can rate my own advice, I think that's fantastic advice.
It is. There is, we've talked about on the show reviews and the toxicity in some of the gaming communities. And that's honestly the best thing, is just focus on positivity.
Yeah.
Focus, and that's not to say keep yourself in an echo chamber, but, it's one thing to be cognizant that there is critical feedback, but there's another thing to just buy into the negativity and let it get you down when you have other people who are overwhelmingly supportive and positive. And that's what we try to put out into the industry as well. And that's why I love working with the authors that we work with, because we are such a good group of people.
Yes, absolutely. I agree 100%.
I think it is. It's fantastic advice. It's a real, I think, positive in what could be a negative area for us to kind of get towards wrapping up on this side of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is negativity out there. And again, you've given an example, and it really rings true for me. Same experiences, probably just at a slightly lower level. But I wrote a book. I won't say what franchise. I won't say IP, anything like that. All I'll say is it is my single best-selling book. And there was a guy on a Facebook page, which was a very popular Facebook page, who tore it to shreds. Yeah. And it got loads and loads of debate over various parts of it. Yeah. Next thing I know, I go to my friendly local gaming store, and the guy who runs it takes me to one side. I saw what happened on the internet. I'm so sorry, your book was a disaster. And it's one guy. One guy. Vincent Rossbond right now is driving a Ferrari F430 based on the profits of that one book. That's fact.
That is not fact.
That would explain. I was wondering that car. I was wondering about that car at Historicon.
Yeah.
We'll just wait till you see what we're driving into Adepticon with.
But I think it is. It's a really good thing that, as you said, no author should put their head in the sand and say, I'm not taking any negative feedback. But it's the difference between negative, constructive feedback and just, trolls flaming, who you can say, no. There are people out there who just kind of want an argument, and it can be a really difficult job to separate. Yep. Okay, someone here said something bad, but they've got a valid point, and I need to get better, and I need to listen and learn from it. Someone here's just trying to, is trying to cause an argument, and is trying to upset people. To just walk away. Yeah,
I would recommend you have some filters, some people that'll look for things for you. yeah, go ahead and look at this. Don't look at that. But there are also places that I won't go.
Yeah.
There are forums and because I mean, it's the psychology of the mask, right? Anonymity does not breed positivity. So you're going, if there's a person out there with a pathology, curled up in the base of their hindbrain, that's where it's going to come out. And I have no interest in interacting with that. So you have to be open. Like, again, it's collaborative. Even when you're coming up with your own story, it's collaborative. You're working with a fantastic editor like Brandon, right? Or another editor. It's collaborative, and you have to be open to advice. You have to be open to suggestions. You have to be open to the idea that you might have had a great idea, but the execution was off. But don't wade into the swamp, because that is only going to drag you down. And as I think every creative person knows, you are your own worst critic, and you're just waiting to hear someone echo the darkest, deepest fears in your head to give them validity. And then you're just going to go down a rabbit hole that's just a horrible nightmare experience. And I would recommend no one do that.
Right.
Find people you trust, find people you believe in. Some idiot on the internet with no visible CV for writing or publishing should never give you agita. Upset stomach. For those of you who don't speak Italian.
I needed the translation. I'll be honest.
It might not even be Italian. It's American Italian. So God knows what it really means.
Well, Craig, what's next on your writing agenda? What do you have in the pipeline that you want to tease?
Well, I'm working on the sequel to Rise of the Alchemist, which is very exciting because my mom really did not like the ending. My mother is my greatest fan and reads everything that I write and is always super positive, to go off of what we were just talking about. And so when she finished Rise of the Alchemist and said, "I hated the ending," I was like, oh God, that hurt. It's like a gut punch. But it's because it was a cliffhanger. And Rise of the Alchemist, which we'll talk about in the next segment, I'm sure. The book is actually 2 books that were designed as one story, and I've never done that before. And so it ended in a cliffhanger, which I don't normally do. And then sadly, there's been a lot of disruption in my life recently that's made it very difficult to finish this book, but I'm almost done. So I'm working on that. I'm hoping to have it done by the end of February. And then I don't know, Brandon, can I talk about the next one?
Absolutely. Why not? Because
Awesome.
this episode, as a background, we are recording this episode in January, but this is probably not going to air until June.
Oh.
So you get this. At this point, it will be announced.
Okay, well, in that case, by the time you're listening to this, I'm hopefully done with a draft of the next Team Z book for Infinity. So I'm super excited to revisit that group of characters and move them on to a next great adventure. And we'll talk more about that in the next segment, or in the next episode, I think, because there's a lot going on there. But I'm very, very excited to be able to revisit that and work with Corvus Belli again.
Great guys. Craig, thanks for coming on the show. It's always a great pleasure talking to you.
Always great to talk to you guys, too. I wish we could just hang out. That would be fun, too. Although recording it while we're hanging out is good content.
Absolutely. That always makes for a good I personally like the YouTube channels and stuff I watch. I like the chill sessions where you just get to see the people interact and you get to see them at their truest nature.
Yeah.
But listeners, please make sure to check back in 2 weeks. We'll have the second part of Craig's interview live. We'll be going over various works that he's produced with us. Craig, where can people find you?
Well, that's a good question. Right now, I'm still on Twitter at the D6G Craig on hashtag blah blah blah, and my website. I'm trying to make sure that I get the whole thing correct. Is thegallantscribe.com, and I promise that I will visit it more often. The thing that I am the worst at in this whole thing is blogging and keeping my Facebook presence up to date. and my blog up to date. So I am on Facebook. Unfortunately, I'm on Facebook like 3 different ways. And I think the one that is the one where you can like see actually contact me is just Craig Gallant, which is really odd because I have Craig Gallant, author. But either of those, you could probably reach me at those as well. And the d6generation.com, you can get all those backlogs and listen to our last big episode that just dropped.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure we put links for all of that when the episode goes live.
Cool.
Excellent. Again, Craig, thank you, as well as all of our listeners supporting us. We'll see you guys in the next episode.
Yes. Bye-bye.